George Habash and the movement of Arab nationalists, neither unity nor liberation. As at AbuKhalil in Khal. In the period following World War I, the Arab intelligentsia was desperately searching for political answers. These were best summed up in the title of Sheikh Arsalan's famous book, Limat Hatta al-Muslimun wa. Limat Hatta Kadamagarahum why have Muslims regressed and others progressed. Arsalan's book, first published in 1906, expressed the frustration of a generation of Muslims and Arabs who had read about the glories of the past and who now faced the political and economic inferiority of the Arab East vis-a-vis the West. Arsalan and like-minded reformers sought to adapt to modern European-inspired, and often imposed, changes without abandoning Islam. Point 2 The search for such political and cultural formulas has continued to the present. Yet the rise of Arab ideologies in this century has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. Point 3 Arab nationalism in general has been dealt with, but it was too easily, and conveniently, dismissed as a failed attempt to emulate Western modes of thought or as a response to Zionism. For before being pronounced dead, Fuad Ajami built his academic career on producing and reproducing its political obituaries. Point 5 Arab communism in Egypt and Palestine has been the subject of recent works, and the Bath, having come to power in two major Arab countries, has generated some interest. But the various other strands of Arab, and narrower cuts, nationalism have yet to be closely examined. Point 6 Prominent among these are the Syrian Social National Party, better known as the Parti Populaire Syrian, PPS, 7 and the movement of Arab nationalists, MAN. Though MAN never seized power and indeed failed in its primary goal of creating a genuinely Arab-wide movement, the story of the ideological revolution in the Arab world cannot be written without at least a chapter on this once powerful political force. MAN has been the subject of some study before, both in Arabic and English. Basil Qubaisi, an active member of the movement who later became a leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, wrote a PhD dissertation on MAN in 1970.8. But while Qubaisi's account is impertant as an insider's view, it is apologetic. He refuses, for example, to knowledge that MAN precursor Kata Ibn al-Fida al-Arabi, the phalanges of Arab sacrifice, henceforth Kata Ibn, was in fact linked with it. Point 9 Furthermore, when referring to the bombing of a Damascus synagogue by members of the Kata Ibn, Qubaisi cites a MAN source, Hani al-Hindi in this case, claiming, without giving evidence, that the synagogue housed a secret Zionist organization that stored weapons in it. It must be said, however, that one reason for his reticence was that he did not want to provide information to the Israelis, who were targeting gifted Palestinian political leaders. Indeed, Qubaisi himself was assassinated by Israeli agents in Paris in 1973. Walid Qatziha, a political scientist at American University in Cairo who was also an active member of MAN, wrote the first scholarly work about the movement. 1. He provides an original account of the emergence of MAN's rightist and leftist factions in the 1960s, though he is hazy, at best, about the origins of the movement to the point of being unaware of George Habash's role in the formation of Kata Ibn. Point 12. Whatever the merits of these early works, they have now been said, along with everything else that has been written on the subject, by Muhammad Jamal Barut's new and important book on the movement. It is difficult not to be enthusiastic about Barut's book. Much research went into its preparation, and it shows. The book is now the definitive account of MAN. Barut has exhausted the literature, though he relies on Arabic Sources only, there is not much he misses in non-Arabic sources, and has interviewed major and minor figures in the movement. It is no exaggeration to say that he went about his project with the determination and acute attention to detail characteristic of the work of Hannah Badadu. Unlike Badadu, however, Barut looks into the socio-economic background of the founders of the movement without drawing political conclusions about the salience of class organizational origins. While other works on the subject, like those of Qubaisi and Suhair al-Tal 13, choose, all too predictably, to trace the movement ideologically to ideas of Afghani, Abda, Kawakabi, etal, Barut wisely begins his tale with the organizational beginnings, namely, with the formation in March 1949 of Kataib al-Fida al-Arabi. Barut renders the organizational and ideological continuity between the two organizations indubitable and tells more about the Kataib than has hitherto been known. The story is perhaps too embarrassing for the living leaders of man, as it is clear that the Kataib, not to be confused with the Lebanese al-Kataib al-Lubnaniyya, was fascistic, if not outright fascist, in formation and ideology. Its anti-Semitism was undiluted. It attacked in August 1949 a synagogue in Damascus and the Alliance Israelite School in Beirut, 14, and its iron-disciplined organization was unmistakable. The Kataib's political program was to avenge the loss of Palestine and to work for the restoration of Arab rights there. It was, however, a small organization that included only tens of members. The Kataib's glorification of violence, commonly assumed to have been inspired by George Habash, a young medical student at the time, was, ac. according to Barut, more influenced by Egyptian Kataib leaders Hussein Tawfiq and Abd al-Qadir Amir. It was they who planned a series of political assassinations before the organization ceased functioning in 1950, the fascination of some of its members with political and military adventurism, especially political assassinations, having caused a rift in its ranks. Barut's rendering of the early phase is crucial because the accounts provided by man's leaders may be inaccurate. For example, when Habash was asked in an interview why he had not joined the Ba'ath following the dissolution of Kataib during his university years, like so many others in the aftermath of the Zionist victory, he replied that he had not been very impressed with the party at the time. He implied that the Ba'ath was not as committed to the liberation of Palestine and to Arab unity as the Kataib, and he mocked the way Ba'athist students sat around coffee houses while Kataib members were advancing the struggle. 15 But in a personal letter to Qubaisi, while the latter was researching his dissertation, Habash admitted that he had actually approached Ba'ath founder Michel Aflaq to suggest that the Kataib become the military arm of the Ba'ath party, the teeth of the party, as Habash put it. 6 Aflaq refused, insisting that Kataib members were welcome to join the Ba'ath as individuals, but not as a bloc or faction. 7 In this and in other instances, Barut's exhaustive interviews and review of the documentation enable him to produce a consistently reliable account. Early influences. The emergence of man like that of Fatah is surrounded with uncertainty, with the founders often disagreeing on the circumstances and Tim. 18 Man was established following the inability of the Kataib to respond to the zeal of young Arab students at the American University of Beirut. AUB, eager to counter the despair and disillusionment that spread among Arab youth after 1948. George Habash had much to do with man's early successes. While one cannot point to any original ideas of Habash in the realm of revolutionary theory, and while his writings, much like those of Fidel Castro, were never More than transcripts of his speeches and statements, he has left an enduring imprint on Palestinian and Arab politics. His charisma served as a magnet for attracting members to MAN and later to the PFLP, which he founded and led. After 1967, this brilliant medical student was able to inspire people from widely differing socio-economic and national backgrounds and to get people of different ideologies and orientations to work together. Even those who deserted the struggle continued to be personally loyal to him and to donate to his movement, both MAN and the PFLP. Moreover, his belated, and grudging, endorsement of Marxism after 1967 was instrumental in turning the Palestinian masses in the occupied territories and the diaspora away from the traditional anti-communism of Palestinian politics. Though Habash's role in the contemporary politics of the Arab world is yet to be written, 19. Barut gives him his due and gives his side of the story its proper weight. Like the Kataib, MAN began as a fascistic organization imbued with vague ideas of Arab unity. Much has been written about the early influence on the movement of Constantine Zurek, born in 1909, an early advocate of SECU Larism and of modern forms of struggle, who motivated young intellectuals to action in the wake of the 1948 defeat, though he may have discouraged revolutionary action, both through his books 20 and his sponsorship of the Al-Urwa Al-Wuthqa Society on the AUB campus. But more important than Zurek in shaping the vague and nebulous ideology of MAN, especially in its formative years, was Ali Nasir al-Din 21, 1888–1974, a Lebanese Druze who, in 1933 founded the Arab nationalist Usbat al-Amal al-Qawmi, calling for Arab unity and liberation from foreign intervention and occupation. Both Qubaisi 22 and Tal mention Nasir al-Din's role, though the latter wrongly equates his thought with that of Zurek 23, but Barut is the first to bring out the extent of his contribution to MAN. 24 Ali Nasir al-Din played a supremely more important and effective role in guiding the movement than Zurek. 25 he writes, adding that Nasir al-Din enriched the movement with his idea of the nucleus in the formation of the movement as a small doctrinaire society established as a fraternity or as a society of believers, a la the National Guard Model 26. Nasir al-Din also influenced the movement with his strong support of the practice of boycotting foreign goods, which later became a cornerstone demand of MAN. The most obvious element of Nasir al-Din's thought that penetrated the movement was his concept of revenge, thar. In writing about the Arab-Israeli conflict, he borrowed the language and outlook of the Jahiliyyah poets. The defeat of the Arabs was, for him, a shame, that had to be erased in order to restore dignity to the nation. 27 Revenge was one of three elements that formed MAN's motto: Wida, Tahrar, Thar, unity, liberation, and revenge. The movement's first mouthpiece, first published in 1952, was named Al-Thar. 28 The movement's anti-Semitism, which was deliberate and thought out, cannot be blamed entirely on Nasir al-Din, as it was present in the Kataib before his influence was felt, but he reduced the fundamentally political/national conflict into a blood feud that could only be settled by restoring national honor, sharaf. The penetration of this atavistic tribal view of the Arab-Israeli conflict into Arab society and culture and the use of imagery of the Jahiliyyah poets was at least partly due to his influence. 29. Nasir al-Din also influenced Habash, but few of his comrades, in what Barut calls Taraniyya 30, Puritanism, though the term Zud, asceticism, would have been more accurate. He espoused total devotion to the cause. This message left its mark on Habash, perhaps alone among the PLO leaders. With the possible exception of Yasser Arafat, to remain uncorrupted by the temptations of the wealthy revolution during its Lebanon sojourn. The asceticism of Habash always formed part of his aura. The movement's concept of al-Ummah, or nation, also bears Nasir al-Din's stamp. Here, Barut provides an interesting comparison between Anton's Aida, the Zaim of the PPS, and man. In Barut's words, the differences between the movement's concept of al-Ummah and its corresponding organizational model, based on the National Guard or the selected elite, and Saida's concept are thus differences at the phenomenal level or that of superficial structure. Both concepts emanate from the same paradigm, or the same structural model, which is the paradigm of the totalitarian concept of the nation. 31. Class or nation. One of the book's highlights is its comprehensive coverage of the 1960s, which reads like an encyclopedic, albeit less suspenseful, version of Malcolm The Arab Cold War. The intricate details of Syrian and Iraqi politics are covered, and the role of the movement is analyzed, though not exaggerated. When the story moves to Yemen and Oman, the author shows the same impressive scholarship, managing to document the less than edifying struggles without taking sides and without showing sympathy or revulsion. He evaluates critically but avoids harsh judgments. One would perhaps have wished for some general conclusions or observations, but drawing conclusions is not Barut's strength. Instead, he is careful to stay focused on the rich data in his possession, appearing to view analysis as a distraction. 32. Later, the movement was handicapped by its reliance on, or cleaving to iltiham in the language of Muhsin Ibrahim, the Nasirist regime insofar as it sacrificed its own organizational interests to serve Nasir. Only Habash, who represented the rightist and pro-Iraqi trend in the 1960s, remained wary. He knew that Nasir did not trust independent political organizations, and wanted man as an appendage to his political/intelligence apparatus. The example of Nasir's negotiations with the Ba'ath leading up to the establishment of the United Arab Republic, UAR, and his insistence that all political parties dissolve themselves was telling in this regard. As a direct result of the Ba'ath's acquiescence, Khalid Bakdash, the Stalinist leader of the Syrian Communist Party, was forced into exile in Eastern Europe after the 1958 Union. Habash refused to meet Nasir until 1964, although he now bears him fondly and cannot mention his name without breaking down. 33. The most important development of the 1960s was the movement's ideological transformation toward Marxism, guided by the two leaders of man's leftist faction, Muhammad Kishli and especially Muhsin Ibrahim. 34. Ibrahim was one of the most gifted pamphleteers in Arab politics. One can still detect traces of his political coinages in present-day Arab political discourse. And he may have been the first to dub the 1967 defeat the Naksa setback, a term enthusiastically adopted by the Nasir regime to soften the impact of the defeat on the Arab masses. Ibrahim knew what words to use for each Zion. He knew what moved the street and what attracted intellectuals. Like Habash, he was a man who could inspire, but, lacking Habash's oratorical skills and magical on-stage presence, he was effective only as long as he stayed behind the scenes. In that, he was like Hawadimah, and the two were to become comrades in arms for decades, especially during the Lebanese Civil War, when Hawadimah's Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP, and Ibrahim's Communist Action Organization, CAO, were sister parties fighting side by side. As important as Ibrahim's gifts as a propagandist were his abilities as a political organizer and agitator. Assuming as early as 1959 the chairmanship of the movement's Thought Committee, Ibrahim progressively took control of its propaganda and information arms. He steered man toward Nasir when the other members gravitated toward Syria and Iraq, and he was later instrumental in introducing the class question at a time when other hardcore nationalists refused to address class issues before achieving liberation and unity. Habash was, of course, chief among these hard-core nationalists. While Habash wanted to concentrate on the struggle against Israel, or the Jews, as the enemy identified itself and was identified at the time, Ibrahim wanted to launch a two-front battle against internal and external enemies. And whereas Habash feared that the introduction of class analysis and class agitation would weaken the nationalist struggle and splinter the Arab Ummah into warring factions, Ibrahim was convinced that the Arab bourgeoisie would not allow Arab unity to survive and would fund Arab reactionary movements. The breakup of the UAR in 1961 confirmed Ibrahim's class orientation. The importance of Mann's 1963 conference with regard to the ideological shift cannot be overestimated. It was then that Ibrahim submitted his report, pushing class conflict to the forefront. Barut rightly compares Ibrahim's role to that of the brilliant Ba'athist Marxist theoretician, Yassin al-Hafiz, when the latter submitted his own revolutionary report, made famous under the title Some Theoretical Points of Departure 35, to the 6th National Conference of the BATH held that same year. Hafiz sought to put the BATH on a Marxist path, a course that raised the ire of the traditional Ba'athists, the Syrian Sami al-Yundi, who authored a well-known and unusually modest memoir, was. While Habash wanted to concentrate on the struggle against Israel, Ibrahim wanted to launch a two-front battle against internal and external enemies. One of those who could not recognize the BATH in Hafiz's report. 36 Similarly, Habash could not recognize his own movement in the writings of Ibrahim, who refused to distinguish between the national struggle and the social struggle, the latter a camouflaged rendering of class struggle. Ibrahim did not want to put one ahead of the other, but preached that both should be waged simultaneously. The reaction of the rightist faction to Ibrahim's initiative was swift. Wadi Haddad, Habash's close comrade from his AUB medical school days, who never cared for ideology and theoretical considerations but believed in an uncompromising military struggle against Israel and imperialism, offered to bomb the offices of the movement's mouthpiece, Al-Hamrats, over which Ibrahim and his leftist clique exercised supreme control. 37 Habash, for his part, had to resort to autocratic rule to suppress the report and to suspend debating it altogether. In so doing, he undoubtedly prolonged the life of the movement. The class issue was not to be resolved until after 1967, when the leftist and rightist factions could no longer coexist and man splintered into several Marxist organizations operating in various Arab countries. The struggle on the pan-Arab level was no longer conceivable, as man proceeded to work on the local level, perhaps in an inadvertent admission of the failure of its revolutionary program. Jews versus Zionists. Muhsin Ibrahim, showing that prejudices and misconceptions can indeed be discarded, also called for a new understanding of the Jewish and Zionist questions. In his early days in the movement, Ibrahim shared the general anti-Semitic outlook of the founders, and indeed his first major work, which became required reading for MAN members, gave the movement's anti-Jew ishness its theoretical basis. 38 Judaism, in the preaching of the movement, was a danger, and no distinction need be made between Zionists and Jews. The movement's mouthpiece in the 1950s called for the expulsion of Jews from the Arab homeland and for the confiscation of their property and the persecution of every lowly one of them because they stood as the historical enemies. 39. In his analysis of anti-Semitism and in line with the phenomenon's European origins, Ibrahim wrote that the teachings of Judaism itself created an international consensus of hatred and contempt for Jews. He further declared that the moral character of Jewish thought fundamentally clashes with every principle and notion that have been agreed upon by PLE 40. Ironically, while the book relies in some of its footnotes on the work of Alfred Lilienthal, it asserts that all Jews are the same, including anti-Zionists like Lilienthal and Elmer Berger. 41. Furthermore, he states that Judaism is not empty words and utterances with no content, but a mighty power that controls governments, bodies, and parties in a large number of countries in the world. 42. The influence of Nasir al-Din is conspicuously present in the text, especially in the introduction, which, yet again, invokes the notion of shame, Nasir al-Din's favorite paradigm. After 1963, that same Ibrahim came to consider the movement's approach to the Jewish question unethical. He called for a total revision and abandonment of anti-Semitism manifested on the pages of Al-Hermziyya, whose new line showed the influence of French leftist writings on the subject. 43. After man's split, Ibrahim pushed the DFLP toward a unique view of the Jewish question, which prompted it to engage in dialogue with Jewish and Israeli leftists at a time when other PLO organizations considered such contacts treasonous. Splintering and decline. Barut covers the developments of the 1960s without giving any one leader disproportionate credit or blame. This is important, as some leaders, such as Habash and Hawadimah, are coming out with their own versions of events. While Habash has always taken care to give credit to others, living and dead, Hawadimah's recent book of reminiscences 44 seems intended to rewrite history by casting himself as the pioneer of Fidei operations. In Hawadimah's account, others were debating theory and ideology while he himself was out forming military groupings under my command, carrying out Fidei actions against U.S. institutions. 45. He seems to have forgotten that during the period he describes there were no U.S. institutions in the West Bank to plot against. 46, but Hawadimah has always been looking for a larger role. He always felt that he was smarter than Habash and was envious that he never enjoyed the popular appeal that Habash attained without even trying. Such rivalries between Habash and Hawadimah, between Hawadimah and Wadi Haddad, and between Haddad and Muhsin Ibrahim all contributed to the state of factionalism that fragmented the movement. The beginning of man's decline can be traced at least to the 1963 Conference. Here was an iron-disciplined organization, run autocratically from above, producing ideological currents it could not contain. Ibrahim, who remained ever the loyal Nasirist, even as he moved progressively further left, gave up on Habash and his comrades and probably remained in the movement mainly because he saw it as necessary to fight Nasir's battles in the Arab East, especially against the communists and the Ba'athists. If there were hopes that the movement might survive, they were shattered by the 1967 defeat. Ibrahim tried hard to rescue Nasir. He argued in an article that no, Nasir did not err, and the Arabs were not defeated. 47. He used emotional rhetoric to shield Nasir from the disdain of Arab revolutionaries. But the era of the Nasirist revolution was over, and the search was underway for new heroes. New heroes soon emerged in the form of anonymous fidaiyin, literally self-sacrificers. Fatah was adept at capitalizing on the new mood, mostly through bombastic flyers taking credit for imaginary victories and operations. The masses were too exhausted and too traumatized to question the accuracy of the declarations. Man had no choice but to compete with Fatah, even if that meant dismantling the Arab nationalist struggle, and even if it meant a recognition of the narrow country, limited to one Arab country, borders that only the day before were considered the artificial creation of imperialism. The 1967 defeat brought awareness that a pan-Arab organization was not feasible. Narrow national sentiments were real, and revolutionary violence required coordination within each state in response to local needs. It also marked the victory of the leftist faction. After that, the argument prevailed among the rank and file that Marxist transformation was inevitable and that scientific socialism, not Nasserism, held the key to victory both against Israel and the internal enemies. Habash alone could not accept the facts, namely, that the version of Arab nationalist struggle that disregarded class struggle was no longer operative in man's circles and that the revolutionary communist struggles against the United States around the world were inspiring Arab youth. He still insisted that Arab nationalism did not need to be abandoned as a goal and as a framework for struggle. While he accepted the necessity of Marxist transformation, at the time he still dreamed of an unspecified Asian Marxism. 48, he argued that the movement could also retain a pan-Arab organization to supervise the struggle at the Arab level. The new movement was named the Socialist Arab Action Party, and it ostensibly supervised all branches of the former movement, or what was left of them. In fact, however, Habash's Socialist Arab Action Party only served as a vehicle for the newly created PFLP. Habash's former comrades quickly broke ranks. Ahmed Jibril, who had merged his own Palestine Liberation Front, created in 1959, and not to be confused with the later Iraqi-supported PLF, into Habash's PFLP when the latter was created in 1967-49 broke away again the following year to form his PFLP General Command. 50 Hawadima. Meanwhile, fearful of a crackdown by impetuous Habash aides like Wadi Haddad, sought Fatah's help to break away from the PFLP to form his own organization, which he initially called the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PDFLP, in a clear swipe at Habash's leadership style within man. Several years later, after threats of extermination were issued, he changed the name to the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP. Even the PFLP's small Lebanese sister party, the Socialist Arab Action Party Lebanon, broke away from Habash. Muhsin Ibrahim, after a stint with Hawadimah's DFLP, went on to form his own CAO, and his role on the leftist side of the Lebanese civil war was pivotal despite the small size of his organization. While Kamal Jumblat spearheaded the Lebanese national movement, the umbrella organization that comprised leftist, Nationalist, and other progressive organizations, parties, and personalities during the Lebanese civil war. It was Muhsin Ibrahim who wrote the statements, declarations, and docu. Man had no choice but to compete with Fatah, even if that meant dismantling the Arab nationalist struggle. Mens, and it was Ibrahim who coined the slogans that mattered. Jumblat recognized his genius and allowed him to play a central role behind the scenes, to the dismay of Jumblat's traditional allies and supporters who feared a communist conspiracy through Ibrahim. Man's legacy. Although Barut exaggerates when he describes man as the most gigantic Accomplished and complete phenomenon in modern Arab political history. 5. He is correct in reading the modern political history of the Arabs in the history of the movement. It is true that man's influence over Arab politics never approached that of the Ba'ath, which thanks to its infiltration of the military and intelligence apparatus in Syria and Iraq was able to seize power in those countries in a series of coups d'état, but Barut's account leaves no doubt that it played a significant role in the politics of Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Syria, and Yemen. It is not easy to evaluate man's legacy, its effects, through the numerous organizations that it produced and through the many intellectuals and students who graduated from its academy, can still be felt in Arab politics. Who would have believed that a zealot member of MAN, none other than Washfi al-Tal, would later engineer massacres of Palestinian guerrillas and civilians in Amman and their expulsion from Jordan in the summer of 1971? Who would have believed that supporters and financiers of MAN in Kuwait, like the poet Su'ad al-Sabah, would later lead a chauvinist Kuwaiti nationalist movement? Or that leftist Lebanese MAN leader Muhammad Kishli, who with Ibrahim prodded the movement's Marxist transformation, would become a close advisor to Lebanese billionaire Rafiq Hariri, who himself had been an enthusiastic member of MAN in Sidon, who in contemporary Lebanese history led the most vicious assault on the poor and their interests in the country. In Oman, a former member of MAN now runs the foreign ministry under the leadership of the Sultan. Former supporters of MAN in Saudi Arabia have long returned to the fold of the royal family, and Ghazi al-Qasibi, who wrote about MAN in his famous novel Shiqtat al-Hurriya 52, is now Saudi ambassador to the United Kingdom. Habash himself remains a widely respected figure, although he has been marginalized in the Islamist era. He is now reduced to heaping praises on Hezbollah and Hamas, trying to rescue himself from total oblivion. After standing unwaveringly for principles, he compromised, making peace with regimes he had previously criticized and often sounding confused about whether he still stood for the total liberation of Palestine. Habash, who preached that the road to Palestine passes through Amman and other Arab capitals, met with King Hussein after the Gulf War. He now has close ties to the Syrian regime and has opened offices for the PFLP in Baghdad, years after his movement had accused Iraqi intelligence of poisoning Wadi Haddad. Habash's wife resides in Amman with their 2 daughters, and while he ostensibly runs the PFLP from Damascus, his deputy, Abu Ali Mustafa, has taken over actual leadership with the support of the organization's military leaders. Habash's ill health and diminished role mirror the health of Arab leftism. Not that the odds against the left were minuscule, but some blame must be placed on those leaders who failed and who adamantly refused to assume responsibility. In this guilt, Arafat and Habash are not that different. Barut's book is a major achievement in historical documentation and in the history of an important era, and it must be translated. The nostalgia for the movement may produce more books and pamphlets, but it is unlikely that any will surpass the comprehensiveness of Barut's account. The events covered in it are rich with setbacks, betrayals, defeats, illogical transformations, and despair, and those who lived part of that era will be able to recognize their own psychological transformations and political evolution in it. Arabs of whatever generation are indeed the product of events and developments that man helped shape.